Now, they may take some villages, they may expand gradually the area of control, but they haven't made that big breakthrough in Donetsk. And of course, why is that important? That 25% of Ukraine of Donetsk that Ukraine holds is the fortified belt. And we know that that is the key in terms of where we land if this invasion ever halts, in terms of who controls that 25. And the Russians aren't getting it at this point.
Hello and welcome to Frontline today with me, Philip Ingram. Now, on day 1,294 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation, or his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we're talking back to Professor Scott Lucas. Scott Lucas, Professor of US Politics at the University College of Dublin's Clinton Institute, and also a founder and editor of EA Worldview. And we're going to try and unravel what's been happening recently. Scott, welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you, Philip. I always hate that word unraveling because it reminds me that things could also go down as well as up. But let's see what we can do.
Go on. What has been happening? There's so much going on at the moment in the geopolitical world. The world's press are focused on Russia's largest attack against Kyiv and hitting the civilian targets, but they're also hitting military targets. And Ukraine has been quite quiet about its use of Flamingo missiles and everything else. Where are we? What's your reading of where we are at the moment?
The easiest way for me to deal with this, Philip, is to actually put the headlines to one side to start off with. What has the Donald tweeted lately? What has Vlad come out with, and out of the Kremlin? How's she doing in Beijing, welcoming everybody there and enjoying all that discounted oil, by the way, that he's getting. And okay, let's take it step by step. All right, if we take it in terms of the Russian invasion, let's say this flat out. Look, that Russian invasion is going to continue beyond day 1300 and well beyond. So all this talk about a ceasefire and going round and round about this, and we'd love to get a ceasefire, and we support efforts to get a ceasefire, but the Kremlin's not going to accept it. And they've signaled they're not going to accept it. And the latest stunt here was Putin says to Zelensky, who he doesn't recognize as legitimate, oh, yeah, I'll talk to you, but you come over here and you sit here in the Kremlin, along with all my other listening devices here, right? And you may or may not get out again. And Zelensky knows what the ruse is, so he tells U.S. media, because he's playing to Trump over the weekend, well, we'll just have Vlad come to Kyiv, and welcome him there. So let's put all that to the side and say, all right, well, where are the Russians with the invasion and where are they going? So the headline is, again, the record-setting drone attacks that took place on Sunday. I'll get to that in just a second. But I just want to emphasize on that front line, they're not achieving that breakthrough. And that's the key thing, because a lot of the media, you'll know this as an expert, military expert, it's hard for those who aren't in on this day-to-day to just drop in and say, how's that frontline war going? They want a big dramatic win or lose story. If we look at Crimea, okay, the Russians have Crimea. If you look in the south, very little has moved in Zaporizhia or Kherson. There was a flutter that, the Russians were going to cross into Dnipropetrovsk region. That was an incursion. That doesn't go anywhere. All right, so we go to the east, and the big action is in the Donetsk region, right? The Russians have 75%. Ukraine's got 25%. How are the Russians doing there? And again, correct me on this. I'm going to go back to this, but my tally is that since May 23, which was when Bakhmut fell, they have taken 4 towns, and only 4 towns in Donetsk. I know Vuhledar, Avdiivka, and a couple others. That's been it, right? Now, they may take some villages. They may expand gradually the area of control, but they haven't made that big breakthrough in Donetsk. And of course, why is that important? That 25% of Ukraine of Donetsk that Ukraine holds is the fortified belt. And we know that that is the key in terms of where we land if this invasion ever halts, in terms of who controls that 25. And the Russians aren't getting it at this point, right? Nor have the Russians been able to establish that foothold in Sumy and in Kharkiv, which they've been trying to get. And indeed, if you buy what the Ukrainians saying, and I think I do, they've gradually regained some territory up there. And by the way, for what it's worth, Ukraine's commander-in-chief, General Syrskyi, is saying that they've regained territory in Donetsk in the past few days as well, around Pokrovsk. We'll see what that means. Effectively, I go back to something that I learned a couple of weeks ago, and I introduced it with you and colleagues at times. I learned from Deep State, which is a very good monitoring organization, November 22, Russians have 18% of Ukraine under occupation. August 2025, the Russians have 19% of Ukraine under occupation. They have taken 1% of Ukraine in almost 3 years, right? And for fans of Blackadder Goes Forth, if you want to talk about General Melchett and so on, I recommend to do it. When he presents the amount of territory that British troops have regained in their dramatic offensive, he puts a small block about 1 foot by 1 foot of turf on the table. And somebody says, well, what's the scale of that? What's the scale of that? And he says, it's 1-to-1. We took 1 foot of territory. Well, hello, Vlad. You could be doing the same thing on your giant table in the Kremlin, for all we know. All right. So that takes us to the attacks on civilians and energy infrastructure. And here's a key link that you make. If Vlad and the boys thought they were winning on the front line at Donetsk, they wouldn't be running the record drone and missile attacks on the rest of Ukraine. They wouldn't need to. But because they're not making the gains there, he's got to step it up in terms of trying to break the will of Ukrainians to resist. And he just keeps doing this and doing this. It's almost like Groundhog's Day.
Yeah, and this is the operational level fight, because for too often commentators measure what you've very eloquently described is the tactical battle and work out whether people are winning or losing on how far a front line has moved on a tactical basis. But this attacking the civilian infrastructure by Vladimir Putin, the attacking of the oil infrastructure by the Ukrainians, and the use of their new Flamingo cruise missiles and all the rest of it, is an operational level fight, trying to influence the ability of the country to continue to support its tactical battle.
Yeah, and so then we get to the question on this front: is are they affecting Ukraine's ability to operate? And there's two dimensions here. One is the specific Ukrainian dimension, and I don't want to downplay the attacks on energy infrastructure. They still cause damage on it. But my reading of it, Philip, and I appreciate this, is they are not causing as much devastation to the energy infrastructure as they did last year, right? We're not seeing as many plants being knocked out of commission completely. And indeed, yeah, Ukrainian plants, right? Now we'll get to the Russian side of the story in a minute. So, there's two things that then happen because of this. The first, then on the other side, actually, I'll go there since you've introduced it, and we should talk about it. Ukraine is stepping up its damage of Russian infrastructure in a very serious way. I think almost every day I'm updating on one, perhaps two Russian oil refineries that have been hit, or it might be pumping stations, especially on the Druzhba pipeline, the one that runs from Russia to down to Hungary. They're hitting other installations that support the military effort, electronics plants, other high-tech plants that they're hitting. They're hitting railway infrastructure. They actually had a sabotage. I think it's probably a sabotage operation, more than 6,000 miles inside Russia overnight, that again hit another target out in the Far East. Now, that's not going to knock Russia out of the war, not going to stop the invasion, but it limits the capacity of the Russians in terms of what they are able to do. All right, so we've got that battle that goes on, but here's my stinger if you take it to the political level. Putin's got a contradiction. In his effort to knock Ukraine out, he risked the diplomatic and political initiative which can be taken by Zelensky and the Europeans. Because, just to put it bluntly, people will go to Donald Trump and say, Donald, Big Don, King Don, Emperor Don, whoever you are, look at what Vlad has done, right? You told him you want a peace settlement, and look at what he's done. And we went through this all during the summer. And of course, it got to the point where Trump was so agitated, he says, I'm going to step up sanctions, 50-day deadline, 10-day deadline. And then Putin rolls him in Alaska not to do that, right? And he gets him to back off of a ceasefire as the priority. But let me bring it up to today. Of course, 3 days after Putin meets with Trump, Zelensky and the Europeans go to the White House. They meet Trump. And the key thing here, Phil, is not what was before the cameras, not the performance. It's that all that discussion of security guarantees was being accompanied by meetings between diplomatic and military staffs to say, all right, if we are going to provide security guarantees for Ukraine, once the invasion is halted, what does it look like? And those discussions are ongoing. And the Americans are not only involved in those discussions, they are chairing some of those discussions. Now, the security guarantees become more likely the more that Vlad keeps hitting Ukraine. That's the paradox that goes on here. And we're back to the sanctions being possible. In the past 48 hours, let me just walk you through a couple signals and see if this makes sense. Scott Bessent, one of the adults in the room in Washington, I'm not a big fan of his in other respects, but he's a guy that knows his stuff. He goes on and he goes on American media over the weekend, especially the Sunday talk shows, which are big, and he says, we're going to consider toughening sanctions again, but the Europeans have to do their bit, right? Now, the way that Bessent frames it, I was reading it as, all right, the Europeans have to accept Trump's tariffs on India, which are using the pretext of Indian purchases from Russia. And the Indians are well ticked off about it. But it's sort of saying, look, Europe, you have to accept that. If the Americans decide, I don't think they'll put tariffs on China over their purchases of Russian oil. But again, the signal is to the Europeans, don't they? But then the follow-up from the Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, was even more interesting, which happened today. Almost no one noticed it. Wright comes out and says, we will toughen our sanctions after the Europeans cut off oil and gas from Russia. Now, the European Union is in the midst of confirming its decision to cut off oil and gas from Russia with a timetable of doing it by the end of 2027. In a Trumpian irony, the main roadblock to that is Donald Trump's friend, Viktor Orban, the authoritarian leader of Hungary, who is standing in the way and saying, oh, but I want my oil from Russia. You can't stop that, right? Here are the Americans saying, which is, all right, Europe, if you do that, then we're going to follow. Now, here's how I read this. And I'm going to combine this and then my work for Trump report. Hi, you all good folks out there, right? Bessent and Chris Wright were signaling to the Europeans what they need to do to get Trump on board. And I'm going to take you back a few years. You'll know this as well as I do. But what was Trump talking about all through his first term? I hate the Germans. I hate the Germans. The Germans, they take oil and gas from Russia. They're terrible. We're going to put 80 million zillion % tariffs on them because of that. We're going to pull out of NATO because of that. All right. So they go to Trump and they say, oh, you know, it's terrible that everybody took their oil and gas from Russia. But look, the Europeans, they're not going to do it anymore. Now we can join the Europeans and run the sanctions on Russia. That, I think, is probably the play. Here's the spoiler here. And it's not Witkoff, the real estate developer, wherever he is today. It's JD, right? Where is JD? Where's the vice president, Vance, scheming at this point? Will he stand to the side if this goes in? Will he try to intervene? All of this is a way of saying, again, marathon, not a sprint, right? That the leading headlines are probably not going to change in the next few weeks and possibly not the next few months, but that gradually what you have is a reaffirmation of some support for Ukraine. And I'll just go back to this. If you had taken me back 6 months ago, if you take me back to March, I don't think we're here. You know, I think that we're all thinking that Trump administration's out of the game economically, politically, militarily. International community, especially the Europeans, are going to have to do all the heavy lifting, and we're wondering whether they can do it. Well, guess what? They have done it.
But yes, yesterday we saw Donald Trump just before he boarded the helicopter, I think, off to see the tennis. He was asked directly by, it sounded like a Ukrainian journalist, whether he was going to take any actions against Vladimir Putin. And his body language suggested exacerbation. He didn't know what to do. And he said, yes, in the next couple of days. Do you think we'll start to see something out of him in the next couple of days, or is he going to find more excuses as to why not to do anything? And do you think he is genuinely exacerbated? And is that because he sees Vladimir Putin as a friend, or the debate has come back out in social media again that Vladimir Putin has got compromat on him, and and therefore is making sure that he doesn't release anything, and he feels between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, what a series of questions. All right, let's talk about King Don. First of all, 2 days or 2 weeks is always his default response. There's going to be a peace settlement in 2 weeks. There's going to be sanctions in 2 weeks. I'm going to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 2 weeks. That's or in 2 days. Like, okay, right. That's just his standard. And he doesn't want to say to that reporter, oh no, I'm not considering. I'm not going to do it because he looks kind of weak, right? So he goes, oh yeah, I'll be considering. All right, that's the throwaway. In terms of the exasperation, no, that's real. The fact here is he genuinely thought he's going to have this sorted by the spring because he and the Russians are going to carve it up, right? And then the fundamental is that the Russians let him down. I mean, the Russians simply, for him to achieve that Nobel Peace Prize, the Russians had to row back on their aims against Ukraine. They had to take what they have right now, but they wanted even more. And they have consistently overplayed their hand with him. And so what happens here is that he's exasperated again. So how do you exploit that exasperation? Right? That's how do you exploit it. And, and Zelensky, again, going on a US channel over the weekend, going on to ABC and saying, look, on the one hand, we need the US in on this. We need the US in on this, but saying, we think they'll do the right thing. He's playing to Trump, through that TV channel. We'll see when he's on Fox next, because, and do it again. And then the Europeans, the French are a bit sidelined today because of their own domestic, political issues. But once the Europeans are back on board, and there's supposed to be a meeting in DC between the Trump folks and the Europeans this week, then they just keep working on Trump like this. You flip this. If you flip this, you say, well, all right, where's the Russians' next play on this, right? Now, the Russians apparently don't have a play to change the facts on the ground. I mean, you could tell me as a military man, but my understanding is probably they got maybe 6 weeks, 2 months before winter starts to set in those areas of Ukraine, right? Their top time for trying to make the breakthrough has kind of gone. They can try to throw more drones and missiles in, but Ukraine appears to be weathering the shock of that. And we talked about the downside of that.
Yeah, no, the Russians have. I don't think the Russians can concentrate a military force enough to create anything decisive in the front line. So we're going to see the stalemate that's there at the moment, unless the Ukrainians are pulling something out of the bag. Because my gut feeling is there's something brewing in the Ukrainian side, but we'll come on to that.
Yeah, well, let's do. But again, then you say, what do they do politically or diplomatically to get the Donald basically to at least fend off the idea of the security guarantees, to fend off the idea that they have to cease fire and so on. And there was a flutter earlier this week from, through Russian state agencies that the Kremlin was considering another invite to him, another showpiece between him and Trump. But again, fact here is the first time you get a Trump, yay, I'm with Vlad moment, which is in Alaska, you get diminishing returns after that. You do it the second and third time, and everybody knows that what Trump wants is he wants to sit down with him and Putin and Zelensky. He wants that to happen. He wants the three-way. So that I think sort of puts it into and I'll add, of course, Russian economy at this point, because I love our commenters on YouTube. You've been saying this for 3 years and Russia hasn't collapsed. Newsflash, we never said Russia was going to collapse. We said that the constraints on Russia's military operations are key. And guess what has just happened? Vlad has just implicitly acknowledged that.
Yeah. Well, and again, for those that are listening, a short time frame in diplomatic terms. The peacekeeping mission that's in Cyprus at the minute, when Turkey invaded northern Cyprus in 1974, I think it was described by the United Nations as a short-term operation. It's been going on since 1974. So whenever we're talking about collapse of the Russian economy and all the rest of it, it's not going to happen tomorrow. It might not happen in the next 3 years or 5 years, but that's still short term.
Yeah, and here's the key immediate moment that we focus on is, so Vlad's in I think he's in Vladivostok in the Far East last week at an economic forum, and he says, "Ooh, we got gasoline shortages." Really? Now, he didn't say why they've got gasoline shortages, which in part is because of the attack on the oil refineries. And Russia does have other problems. They got problems with transport system and so on. But the fundamental is Russia's got gasoline problems. They've got rationing in parts of the country. They've got queues, long lines to get gasoline in other parts of the country. They have got on top of this, newsflash this week is that the central bank has come out again and said we've got worries about inflation. And indeed, the head of one of their largest banks, their state-supported bank, Herman Graf, said, economy's flatlining. We could be going into recession. So combination of recession, inflation, pressure on resources, and you're still going to try to maintain your military invasion at breakneck speed by doing all of that. I don't, and my question is, I don't think I'm not sure if the Ukrainians are going to step it up. I think they'll maintain the level of attacks, but I'd have to ask you where we are with the long-range missile, the Flamingo, which they are doing a big PR job on. We've got a domestically produced long-range missile. How viable is that missile going to be in terms of changing the balance?
Well, it's very viable. It all depends on the numbers that they've got. But you're right; they're doing a big PR job. And one of the best bits I saw was when they put some footage out of in the factory and chalked on the side of two of the missiles. One was 178 and the other was 179. And everyone's assumed that that's the production numbers that are going through. So just to scare the Russians, there's 179, probably 180 missiles waiting to go. It's a big missile, very capable. But what is interesting at the minute is the way Ukraine is systematically destroying Russia's air defense capability through Crimea and through another couple of paths in occupied the Donbass, but also into Russia as well. And that will allow the Ukrainians then to potentially use the Flamingo missile is not particularly stealth. Most modern cruise missiles survive because they're stealth missiles. This isn't stealth, so you need to do what is called suppression of enemy air defense before you fire those at your primary targets so that they don't get shot out of the sky by air defense missiles. Ukraine is doing that at the minute and is doing it all across Crimea. So it wouldn't surprise me if the Kyiv bridge is going to get thumped at some stage soon by a lot of them. And 1.15 tons of high explosives going in. It's got a range of 3,000 kilometers, so it can do a circuitous route around to get at them, and they can have them coming from multiple directions. It'll be interesting. Something is brewing, I think.
That's a great point. I am going to add a caveat to that, Philip, which will not be a well-known story that we do need to keep our eyes on. And I've got a fantastic young journalist who's working on this story for me for the site that I run, EA Worldview. The fly in the ointment right now is domestic Ukrainian politics. You might remember a few months ago, we were talking about the attempt by parliamentarians to curb the anti-corruption agencies. And the focus at that point was the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. You saw the protests that came out that forced Zelensky to withdraw or reverse his signature of that legislation. But the legislators are back at it again, trying to curb the Bureau of Economic Security, which is also, and that bill is in its second reading in the Parliament today. Tomorrow on Tuesday. And of course, there are still people who are being investigated within the Ukrainian system on corruption charges, and this appears to be their next shot against this. What's the upshot of all of this? I could talk to you a little bit about how it hinders Ukraine's relationship with the EU. I can talk a little bit about how it makes it tricky regarding the financial aid that Ukraine gets. But where we are right now is that one of the problems we've got right now which is Firepoint, which is the maker of the Flamingo missile. There is being investigated for jacking up prices for its drones. Now, I just meant just investigated, not convicted, not found, but it's being investigated. That has been a fly in the ointment. Part of the reason why, and this is why we title now, why there was such a PR effort around the Flamingo, some would say was to take away from the investigation of Firepoint, right? And what we have to hope here is no, actually the Flamingo does have this capability. It's not just simply being bigged up.
Yeah, but then the fact that there's an investigation going on and that's coming out, in the old Ukraine following the Soviet style, someone would say there'd be an investigation and the oligarch would have them killed. The fact that there is now an investigation going on and it's looking at it to make sure that the money is not being wasted and prices aren't being artificially inflated, no matter what the outcome of the investigation, the fact that it is happening is showing that there is a level of oversight that should bring confidence with it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I mean, that to me, that episode earlier this summer highlighted the fact that you could get democracy, you could get accountability. It's an ongoing fight which takes place here, but the site that has broken the story about the investigation is the Kyiv Independent, which is a relatively new publication, very distinctive from the older Ukrainian publications that were linked to the oligarchs. So I think, perhaps on another intent and another frontline, we could talk about this is a fascinating story in Ukraine, the way it is evolving and changing.
Oh, when that breaks, we will talk about it. Yes.
Yeah. But to me, it's another, we've talked a lot about that Putin's gamble in February 22. We talk about whether it's a hinge point on history on multiple occasions. And to me, it's a hinge point for the future of Europe. I've talked about this before, the way the EU develops, the way that NATO develops. We don't know exactly where it'll swing as a hinge point given the intersection with the US because Trump is such a wild card here, but it's also a hinge point for Ukraine. I mean, this is a country which is just over 30 years old in terms of being newly independent. It had a lot of systems which were riddled with corruption, riddled with the old Soviet way of doing things. But what you have actually genuinely seen is that as Ukrainians, we don't want it this way. We don't want it done the old way. And I think Putin has fueled that. I think the irony here is that Putin justifying this invasion by a caricature of this was a Nazi government, this was a corrupt government, it hates Russians, has actually spurred Ukrainians to try to make their government better.
Brought Ukraine closer to the potential for EU membership because they're starting to meet the criteria for EU membership and all the rest of it. Scott, I think you've highlighted a number of things that means that we're going to have more of these. So thank you very much indeed for talking to me today on Frontline.
Thanks. All you good folks, stay safe, stay sane. All right.